At my son's graduation dinner, his girlfriend's father looked me up and down, leaned toward his wife, and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, I thought Conrad said his dad was some kind of engineer. He looks more like the guy who fixes the boiler. His wife laughed. My son stared at his plate. I smiled, folded my napkin, and waited. By the end of that evening, I had everything I needed. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is that I spent 34 years as a structural engineer for the city of Portland, Oregon, the kind of work that doesn't make headlines but holds bridges up. I retired at 63 with a pension, a paid-off house, and a '97 Chevy truck I've driven since my son was in middle school. I'm not a flashy man, never was. My late wife used to say I dressed like a man who had nothing to prove, and she meant it as a compliment. My son is 27. Smart kid, always was. He got his MBA from the University of Oregon on a partial scholarship, and the rest on loans we paid down together. He works in supply chain management now, good company, good salary. When he told me last spring that he was serious about a woman he'd been seeing for 8 months, I was glad. He sounded steady when he talked about her. Settled. That's all a father wants to hear. Her name I'll leave out. She's not the villain of this story. She's just a young woman who was raised a certain way and hasn't yet decided whether that's the way she wants to stay. What I'll say is that her family has money. Not old money, not the quiet kind, the kind that was made quickly in commercial real estate and wore itself loudly. Her father drives a new Escalade. Her mother's jewelry catches light from across a room. They live in Lake Oswego, which is Portland's way of saying, we have a gate and we'd like you to notice it. The dinner was her father's idea. His wife organized it. A restaurant called Hargrove's, new place on the waterfront, the kind that doesn't list prices on the menu because the assumption is you won't need to. I wore a clean button-down and my good jacket, the charcoal blazer I've had since my wife's sister's wedding 9 years ago. It fits well. It's wool. It doesn't shout, but it doesn't apologize either. I arrived 5 minutes early. My son was already there, standing near the entrance with his girlfriend. She hugged me warmly and said she was glad I'd come. She seemed genuine. I liked her for that. We were waiting for her parents when the Escalade pulled up to the valet. Her father was taller than I'd expected, broad across the shoulders, silver watch visible even from 10 feet away. Her mother stepped out in a cream blazer, handbag I recognized as expensive, because my wife had once pointed one out in a magazine and said she could never spend that much on a bag. He introduced himself as Reginald, I'll call him that here, and shook my hand with the kind of grip that's measuring something. His wife, Constance, air-kissed my son's girlfriend and glanced at me with a smile that said she'd already placed me somewhere on a list. We sat. The waiter appeared. Reginald ordered a bottle of wine I'd never heard of and asked if I was familiar with it, which is a question that only has one honest answer between two strangers. No. I told him that. He nodded the way people nod when they've confirmed a suspicion. The first 20 minutes were fine enough. My son talked about his work. His girlfriend talked about a trip they were planning. Constance described their recent renovation, a kitchen remodel that cost, she mentioned twice, more than some people's cars. Reginald had the ease of a man who had learned to fill rooms. He talked about a development project in Bend, a waterfront property in Astoria, a deal they'd closed last fall that had apparently impressed people who knew what they were talking about. When he turned to me, it felt like a deliberate pause. So, my son tells me you were in engineering. Structural engineering, I said. City infrastructure. Portland Public Works for 34 years. He nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something he'd suspected. Municipal work. His voice was pleasant. Steady paycheck, good benefits. Smart choice for someone who wants to keep it simple. I kept my expression even. I built the Burnside Bridge retrofit, the Marquam ramp rehabilitation, worked on the Morrison seismic upgrade in '09. He smiled. Not the impressed kind, the patient kind. Well, someone has to do it. Constance changed the subject to the restaurant's menu. My son looked at me for just a second, then looked away. It was when we were waiting for the main course that it happened. Reginald leaned toward his wife, but his voice carried, because men who are used to being the center of a room don't calibrate for discretion. I thought Conrad said his dad was some kind of engineer. He looks more like the guy who fixes the boiler. Constance covered her mouth, not entirely. My son's girlfriend went still. My son stared at his bread plate. The table nearby, close enough, had paused their conversation. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. In 34 years of public works, I dealt with city council members, federal inspectors, contractors who cut corners and then lied about it to my face. I learned a long time ago that the moment right after an insult is worth more than the insult itself. What you do with that moment tells everyone in the room who you actually are. I set down my glass. I smiled. Not the tight kind, the genuine kind, the kind that doesn't cost you anything. Then I said, loud and easy, Reginald, the man who fixes the boiler, usually knows more about how the building works than anyone else in it. There was a beat of silence. My son's girlfriend looked at me. Her expression was something I couldn't fully read. Surprise, maybe, and something underneath it that might have been respect. Reginald laughed, but it landed wrong. His wife was quiet. The dinner finished without further incident, on the surface. But I drove home that night with my hands steady on the wheel, and my mind doing what it had done for 3 decades when something wasn't adding up. Going through the details, looking for the shape of the thing, my son called me the next morning. He started with the weather, which told me he was working up to something. Finally, he said, Dad, about last night. I just want to say I know it wasn't. I should have said something. I told him not to worry about it. There was a pause. He said, Reginald is a pretty important guy in Portland real estate. I don't want things to be awkward. I told him I understood. And I did. I understood completely. The next week, I called an old colleague named Felix. And I mean old. We'd worked together since 1993. He'd since moved into private consulting. I asked him what he knew about Reginald's development company. Felix laughed, not unkindly. He said, I know they move fast, and they don't always move clean. He told me about a project in 2019 that had gone sideways, permits that move through city review faster than they should have, a variance on a wetland buffer that 2 different environmental groups had formally contested. Everything settled out of public record. That interested me. I spent 3 days doing what engineers do, looking at structure, not buildings. The legal and financial structure of a business that moves fast and doesn't always move clean. Business registrations are public. Permit applications are public. Zoning variance records are public. I knew where to look because I'd spent 34 years on the other side of those desks. What I found wasn't criminal. It was, however, exactly the kind of aggressive that attracts scrutiny. A project in Gresham, where the environmental impact report had been filed with data from a site 2 counties over. Not identical conditions. A commercial rezone application in Clackamas that had been supported by a traffic study using outdated methodology. I recognized the firm's name. They'd submitted the same flawed models to the city in 2017 and been quietly flagged for it. A senior housing development that had received tax increment financing based on affordability commitments that, based on the current lease rates I found in public records, appeared to no longer be honored. I made notes, organized folders, kept everything sourced. It took me about 2 weeks. By the end of it, I had 4 folders, each with documentation, source links, and a clear summary of the discrepancy between what had been represented and what public records showed. I didn't do anything with them yet. That Saturday, my son called to say that his girlfriend's parents were hosting a dinner at their house in Lake Oswego. A family gathering, he said. Her brother was in town. Her parents wanted to bring everyone together. He said it like he was asking permission without asking permission. I said I'd be there. The house was the kind that makes a statement before you reach the door. Stone facade, 3-car garage, a landscaped front yard that looked more maintained than used. Reginald answered the door with a glass already in his hand and the satisfaction of a man on his own turf. Welcome, he said. Glad you could find it okay. I've lived in the Portland metro area for 40 years. I know where Lake Oswego is. The living room had art on the walls, the kind you buy because it's expensive, not because you love it. Constance was warm in the way of a woman who has had practice being warm to people she hasn't decided about yet. The brother was named something I'll forget deliberately, not important to the story, only relevant in that he shook my hand and immediately returned to talking about his investment portfolio to anyone who would listen. My son and his girlfriend sat close together on the couch. She looked at me with an expression I was starting to recognize, watchful, like she was waiting to see what I would do. Dinner was catered. Reginald mentioned it twice, the name of the company, the price per head, the fact that they'd used them for a charity gala the year before. I ate quietly. The food was very good. I said so. At some point, Reginald steered the conversation toward my retirement. So you're all settled now? He said. Pension kicks in, that's that? Pretty much, I said. He nodded, turning his wine glass slowly. Constance said, "It must be nice, the certainty of it. Government work is so reliable that way." She said it the way you describe a child's drawing, generous and meaningless. Later, while the others moved to the living room, Reginald and I stood in the kitchen. His wife had gone upstairs. My son was helping his girlfriend clear the table. It was just the two of us. He poured himself another glass and said, conversationally, "I'll be honest with you. I wasn't sure what to expect from Conrad's father. No offense." He held up one hand. "Small city salary, truck that's older than some of my employees." I assumed a certain, he searched for the word, ceiling. I looked at him. He seemed entirely comfortable saying this. That was the interesting part. I said, "And what do you think now?" He smiled, same as before, "But I appreciate that you're not resentful about it." I nodded, said, "I appreciate you being honest." On the drive home, I stopped at a coffee shop that stayed open late. Sat at a corner table for an hour, opened the Notes app on my phone, wrote 4 words, time to be thorough. What I want to be clear about is this. I didn't do what I did out of anger. Anger is hot. What I felt had gone cold by then, the way water goes cold when it's been sitting still long enough. What I did because I have spent my entire professional life believing that public accountability is not optional, that when someone uses public systems, permits, zoning variances, tax incentives, and misrepresents material facts in those applications, that is not aggressive business strategy. That is fraud adjacent to the public interest. I filed a formal complaint with the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development regarding the environmental impact discrepancy in the Gresham project. I provided documentation, source citations, and a clear narrative of the inconsistency. I filed a separate complaint with the Oregon Housing and Community Services Department regarding the tax increment financing commitments on the senior housing development, with current lease rates attached, pulled from public records, showing the gap between what was promised and what was charged. I did not file anything anonymously. My name is on every document. I'm not interested in hiding. That's not how I operate. I sent copies to a journalist, a woman at the Portland Tribune who covers development and housing accountability. I've read her work for 3 years. She's careful. She doesn't sensationalize. I sent a cover letter explaining who I am, what I'd found, and where she could verify everything. I noted that I had a personal connection to the company's principals, but that the documentation stood independently of that fact, and I invited her to verify every source before publishing a word. Then I went home and did laundry. 3 weeks passed. Routine. Morning walks, coffee on the porch, a project I'd been meaning to finish in the garage. My son called twice. Both times he seemed fine, or at least performing fine. I didn't tell him anything yet. That wasn't evasion. I needed to know how things would land before I decided what to say. The journalist published a piece at the end of the month. She'd done her own reporting, found additional instances I hadn't identified, interviewed a former tenant of the senior development, who described the rent increase that had followed the affordability commitment period. The piece was careful, factual, appropriately sourced. It mentioned that a formal complaint had been filed with 2 state agencies. By the following Monday, I had a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. It was Reginald. His voice had a quality I recognized from 34 years of project meetings when something had gone structurally wrong. Controlled but pressurized, like a pipe before it fails. He said, "I'd appreciate a call back." He said, "I think we should talk." He said, "I'm sure this is a misunderstanding." I waited 2 days, then called him back. He answered on the first ring. His voice was smoothed over, friendly, professional. He said he'd seen the article. Said there were inaccuracies, that his attorneys were reviewing the matter, that these kinds of complaints, from people with personal grievances, were unfortunately not uncommon in the development world. I said, "I don't have a personal grievance, Reginald. I have documentation." He paused, then said, quieter, "What is it you're actually after here?" I said, "Nothing from you." I reported what public records showed. The agencies and the journalist have it now. If the records are wrong, your attorneys can demonstrate that. If they're right, your company will pay the appropriate penalties and adjust its practices. He said, "You're doing this because of a comment at a restaurant." I said, "I'm doing this because it needed to be done." The comment at the restaurant told me something about your character that made me look more carefully at your business. What I found there was worth reporting on its own merits. He said, "I could make things difficult for your son." I let that sit for a second. Then I said, "Reginald, I was a civil engineer for the city of Portland for 34 years. I've testified before city council. I've filed depositions. I've had my professional judgment challenged by people with much better lawyers than you can afford right now. If you want to make things difficult, you'll need to be more specific about how, because a threat with no structure behind it isn't a threat. It's noise. The line was quiet. I said, "Is there anything else?" He hung up. I wrote down the time and content of the call, added it to the folder. My son found out 3 days later. His girlfriend had told him. He showed up at my house without calling, which he never does, and I knew before he reached the door what this visit was about. He sat down at the kitchen table. He looked tired. He said, "Dad, did you file complaints against Reginald's company?" I told him yes. He put his hands flat on the table. He said, "I need to understand why." I walked him through it, all of it, the documentation, the specific discrepancies, the public interest in each complaint. I didn't frame it as personal. I showed him the folders. He looked at them for a long time. He's smart, my son. He always has been. He said, "The environmental report thing, that's real?" I said, "It's in there." He said, "And the senior housing? They promised affordable rates and then raised them?" I said, "The documentation supports that conclusion." He leaned back. He looked at the ceiling. He said, "He told my girlfriend that you did this because he insulted you at dinner." I said, "He insulted me at dinner." Then I looked at his company's record. Both things happened. My son was quiet for a while. I poured us both coffee and set his mug down without a word. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, someone's dog barked twice and stopped. Finally, he said, "I should have said something that night." I said, "Yes, you should have." He nodded, looked at his coffee. I thought about his mother, who would have been reading the whole conversation from the doorway before we'd even noticed her there. She had a talent for that, for understanding what was actually being said when people were saying other things. I missed her in that particular way, the way that shows up in moments like this one. He said, "Is there more? Are you going to do anything else?" I said, "I filed what I filed. The rest is up to the agencies. I'm not interested in going further than what was necessary." He said, "And if Reginald retaliates?" I said, "I've been building cases my whole career, not legal cases, engineering cases. Pile of documented evidence, load-bearing facts, structure that holds. If he comes at me, I'm ready for it." My son looked at me the way he used to look at me when he was 12, and I was explaining something that took him a second to catch up to. Then he nodded. He said, "Okay." That was enough. 2 weeks later, the Oregon Housing and Community Services Agency issued a preliminary finding on the senior housing complaint. The affordability commitment discrepancy was confirmed. Reginald's company was required to submit a compliance remediation plan and face potential repayment to the state housing fund. The DLCD complaint was still under review. His girlfriend called me herself. She was direct about it, which I respected. She said, "I need to ask you something. Did you do this because of my family, or because of what you actually found?" I said, "Both things are true at the same time. Your father told me what kind of man he is." I went looking to see if his business reflected that. It did. She was quiet. Then she said, "He's not a bad person. He grew up where money was everything, and he never stopped thinking that way." I said, "I know. That's not a defense, but I understand it." She said, "My mom is mortified." About the article. I said, "About the article? Or about what the article is about?" She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "Probably both." I said, "That's fair." There was a pause. She said, "Conrad thinks the world of you." I said, "I know he does, and I think the world of him. That's not connected to any of this." She said, "I hope we can." She stopped, started again. "I hope my family can figure out how to move forward." I said, "So do I, for your sake and my son's." We said goodbye. It was the most honest conversation I'd had with anyone in that family. The state process moved slowly, the way state processes do. By early fall, the DLCD had opened a formal review of the Gresham project. Reginald's company hired a firm that specialized in regulatory defense. They were expensive and good. I knew because the Tribune journalist wrote a follow-up piece that mentioned the firm by name. 3 of Reginald's development partners quietly ended their joint venture agreements. It was in the public business filings. I checked every 2 weeks, the way I used to check load tolerances on active projects. Not obsessively, professionally. Reginald didn't call again. Neither did Constance. My son and his girlfriend stayed together. She came to Sunday dinner once in September, just the 3 of us, and she helped clear the table without being asked and asked me questions about the bridge rehabilitation projects because my son had apparently told her about them. It was a quiet evening. Good, the way simple things are good. He called me a week later and said, She wants to know if you'd come to Thanksgiving at her parents' house. I said, Does Reginald want me there? My son was quiet for a second. Then he said, I think Reginald has had some time to think about things. I said, I'll come. But I won't apologize for what I filed, and I won't pretend the dinner at Hargrove's didn't happen. My son said, I know. I wouldn't ask you to. I said, and I need you to understand something. What happened that night, the comment you looking at your plate, that stayed with me. I need to know that if something like that happens again, you'll say something. He said, I will. I should have then. I'm sorry, Dad. I told him it was okay. And it was not entirely, not in the way that erases things, but in the way that moves forward without pretending. I arrived at their house in Lake Oswego on Thanksgiving with a pie I'd made myself, pecan, my wife's recipe, and a bottle of wine I'd chosen carefully, not expensively. Reginald answered the door. He looked like a man who had been practicing this moment for a few weeks. He said, Glad you could come. I said, Thank you for the invitation. There was a beat between us, not comfortable, not hostile. Something more honest than either of those. He said, I owe you an apology. For the restaurant, I said something stupid and small, and I said it where people could hear it. I looked at him. He wasn't doing it gracefully. There was nothing smooth or practiced about it. His jaw was tight. He said it like a man who wasn't used to saying it. I said, I appreciate that. He said, I looked up that bridge project, the Burnside retrofit. I waited. He said, That's serious work. I said, Yes, it is. He nodded, stepped back to let me in. Constance took the pie and said it looked beautiful. My son was in the kitchen. His girlfriend was setting the table. The brother was there, quieter than before. We sat down to dinner. It wasn't easy, exactly, but it was real, which is better. I drove home that night with the radio on low and the heater running against the November cold. Portland looked the way it always looks in late fall, wet streets, amber lights, the kind of gray sky that other people move away from, and I've always found peaceful. I've built things in this city for 34 years. Not famous things. Useful things. Things that hold. I parked in my driveway and sat for a minute, not thinking about anything in particular, just sitting. My wife had a saying she used when something had gone wrong, and then, eventually, right again. She'd look at me and say, Well, we found out what we're made of. I got out of the truck, locked it, and went inside.